In 1963, one single factory controlled 25% of every bicycle sold in America. 1 out of every 4 bikes carried the exact same name. The massive brick fortress on Kildare Avenue in Chicago ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, with thousands of workers pouring molten steel to create the indestructible machines that defined millions of American childhoods. They were completely untouchable, the absolute dictator of the market. And then, the floors sat empty. The workers were gone. The machines were silent. The entire empire completely evaporated. A century of absolute dominance traded away for cheap foreign labor, leaving behind a silent tomb in the heart of Chicago. How does something that important just disappear? Chapter 1: The Foundation of the Chicago Empire. The year was 1891. Ignaz Schwinn arrived in Chicago with almost nothing. He was a German immigrant with a head full of mechanical blueprints and a singular obsession: he wanted to build bicycles. At that time, Chicago was the industrial beating heart of America. Smoke stacked into the sky. Trains roared through the rail yards. Men built fortunes from steel and sweat. Ignaz Schwinn intended to build his from steel tubes and chain drives. He found a partner in Adolf Arnold. Arnold had money. He was a meat packer who saw the emerging bicycle craze and wanted a piece of the action. In 1895, they founded Arnold, Schwinn and Company. They built a massive brick factory on the west side of Chicago. The timing looked perfect. America was in the grip of a bicycle frenzy. Hundreds of companies sprang up overnight to feed the insatiable demand. But frenzies do not last. By the turn of the century, the bicycle bubble burst violently. The automobile arrived. People traded pedals for combustion engines. The market collapsed. Over 300 bicycle manufacturers went bankrupt in a matter of a few years. Factories shuttered. Machinery rusted. The industry was absolutely decimated. Ignaz Schwinn did not panic. He analyzed the shattered market. He understood that survival required scale and aggressive diversification. Instead of retreating, he advanced. He bought out his struggling competitors for pennies on the dollar. He absorbed their equipment, their patents, and their distribution networks. He consolidated power. Eventually, he even bought out his own partner. Adolf Arnold walked away, leaving Ignaz with total control of the company that would bear his family name for the next century. Schwinn realized that bicycles alone might not keep the factory doors open through hard times. He pivoted his manufacturing focus. He purchased the Excelsior Motor Manufacturing Company and later the Henderson Motorcycle Company. For a time, the Chicago factory pumped out heavy, roaring motorcycles. They dominated national racetracks. They built a legendary reputation for bulletproof reliability. This mechanical cross-training proved vital. Schwinn engineers learned how to build heavy-duty frames. They learned how to weld stress points that could handle brutal, high-speed punishment. They applied these strict motorcycle engineering standards directly to their bicycle production. Then came October 1929. The stock market crashed. The Great Depression swallowed the American economy whole. Poverty spread like a virus. Millions of men lost their jobs overnight. Factories across Chicago locked their iron gates. The motorcycle division died instantly. People could barely afford bread, let alone a luxury vehicle. Ignaz Schwinn was aging. His son, Frank W. Schwinn, took control of the daily factory operations. Frank faced a dying company in a dead economy. The adult bicycle market was completely gone. Adults needed paying jobs, not leisure rides in the park. Frank made a ruthless, brilliant calculation. If adults were not buying, he would target the only demographic that still begged their parents for things: children. But children treated bicycles terribly. They dropped them on concrete. They crashed them into brick walls. The flimsy, European-style racing bikes of the 1920s snapped under the abuse. Frank Schwinn decided to build a bicycle that a child could not destroy. He traveled to Europe and studied heavy balloon tires used on airplanes and motorcycles. He brought the concept back to the Chicago factory. He ordered his engineers to design a bicycle around these massive 2 1/8-inch tires. They reinforced the steel frames using the old motorcycle welding techniques. They added a simulated gas tank. They attached a streamlined headlight. They made it look exactly like a motorcycle. In 1933, Schwinn released the B10E motorbike. It weighed a massive 50 pounds. It rolled on wide, indestructible tires. It was practically a steel tank with pedals. And it changed the industry forever. Kids saw the bike and lost their minds. It looked powerful. It looked dangerous. It survived jumps, crashes, and drops without bending a single tube. While the rest of the American economy starved, the Schwinn factory in Chicago roared back to life. Sparks flew on the welding floors. The heavy presses stamped out steel parts around the clock. Assembly lines pushed out hundreds of units a day to keep up with the frantic demand. Competitors scrambled to copy the design. Schwinn outmaneuvered them at every turn. Frank Schwinn pushed his engineers to innovate relentlessly. They created the stunning Aerocycle. They introduced the built-in kickstand. They patented the cantilever frame, a structural design so strong it would remain the global industry standard for decades. More importantly, Frank revolutionized how bicycles were sold. He refused to sell his premium machines through cut-rate department stores or cheap catalog companies. He built a tight network of independent, authorized dealers. You had to go to a certified Schwinn shop. You bought from a mechanic who knew the machine inside and out. This strategy built an undeniable aura of prestige. A Schwinn was not just a cheap toy. It was an investment. It was a status symbol. By the end of the 1930s, the dust of the Great Depression finally settled. The bodies of failed companies littered the industrial landscape, but the Schwinn factory stood taller than ever before. Ignaz Schwinn's aggressive gamble had paid off. Frank Schwinn's brilliant pivot had saved the entire empire. They survived the bubble burst of the 1890s. They survived the death of their motorcycle division. They survived the worst economic collapse in modern history. As World War II loomed, Schwinn held an untouchable position. They controlled a massive slice of the American bicycle market. The massive factory in Chicago was no longer just a building. It was a defining institution. It employed generations of families. Fathers trained their sons on the assembly line. They poured molten steel. They laced tight spokes. They painted heavy frames with meticulous care. The brand became entirely synonymous with American resilience. If you bought a Schwinn, you knew it would last. You knew it would pass down to your younger brother, and maybe even your son. The Chicago Empire was fully established. The foundation was forged in heavy steel and welded with unmatched precision. They stood at the absolute peak of American manufacturing. But peaks are dangerous places. When you stand at the very top, you stop looking up. You stop watching the ground beneath your feet. And the ground in Chicago was slowly preparing to shift. Chapter 2: The Wheels That Shaped America. The Second World War ended, and America entered an era of unprecedented prosperity. Millions of soldiers returned home. They bought houses in newly built suburbs. They started families. The baby boom began. Madison, within a decade, millions of children would fill the streets and sidewalks of every American neighborhood, and every single one of those children would want a bicycle. The Schwinn factory in Chicago was perfectly positioned to capture this massive demographic explosion. They had survived the Depression and outlasted their competitors. Now, they prepared to conquer the post-war market. In 1949, they released a machine that would define the era. They called it the Black Phantom. The Black Phantom was not just a bicycle. It was a statement of ultimate status on the neighborhood block. It featured a patented Springer front fork, a leather saddle, heavy chrome fenders, and thick white wall tires. It had a built-in horn tank and a battery-powered headlight. It weighed nearly 60 pounds. It was expensive. It cost nearly as much as a used car. Yet, it became the undisputed king of the American sidewalk. Boys begged their parents for it. They delivered newspapers for years just to save up the money. The Black Phantom solidified Schwinn as the premium brand in the minds of the American public. But a great product needed a great sales strategy. Frank Schwinn tightened his grip on how his bicycles reached the public. At a time when massive catalog retailers like Sears and Montgomery Ward dominated the market with cheap, generic bicycles, Schwinn refused to play their game. He cut ties with hardware stores and discount retailers. He built a network of exclusive, authorized Schwinn dealers. If you wanted to buy a Schwinn, you had to walk into a dedicated bicycle shop. These shops had clean floors and bright displays. They had professional mechanics working in the back. Every bicycle was fully assembled, tuned, and tested before it left the door. Other brands shipped their bikes in cardboard boxes for the parents to assemble with cheap tools. A Schwinn rolled out of the showroom ready to ride, backed by a lifetime guarantee. This strategy was brilliant. It elevated the brand from a simple toy to a precision mechanical vehicle. It built fierce loyalty among shop owners and customers alike. By the early 1960s, the children of the baby boom were entering their teenage years. The market was changing again. Down in Southern California, kids were taking matters into their own hands. They took old bicycle frames and attached high-rise handlebars. They bolted on long banana seats. They stripped off the heavy fenders to make the bikes look like the customized chopper motorcycles roaring up and down the Pacific Coast Highway. Al Fritz, a brilliant Schwinn executive, traveled to California and noticed this underground trend. He watched kids building these strange, modified bikes in their garages. He recognized the potential immediately. He returned to Chicago and pitched a radical idea to the conservative board of directors. He wanted to mass-produce a chopper-style bicycle. The board hated the idea. They thought the design looked ridiculous. They believed it was a regional fad that would pass in a few months. Fritz ignored their skepticism and pushed the project through anyway. In 1963, Schwinn launched the Stingray. The impact was instantaneous and explosive. The Stingray featured a low-slung frame, a brightly colored banana seat, and tall ape hanger handlebars. It had a smaller 20-inch front wheel for sharp turning and a slick rear tire for skidding. It did not look like a traditional bicycle. It looked like rebellion on two wheels. The American youth market lost its collective mind. Demand outstripped supply almost overnight. Dealerships sold out within hours of receiving shipments. The massive Chicago factory had to retool its assembly lines to keep up with the frantic orders. Workers put in exhausting overtime shifts. The heavy stamping machines pounded out steel frames around the clock. By the end of 1963, Schwinn had sold tens of thousands of Stingrays. By the end of the decade, they would sell millions. It became the best-selling bicycle model in the history of the world. The Stingray was not just a product, it was a cultural phenomenon. It defined the childhood of an entire generation. But Schwinn did not just dominate the youth market. They also captured the adult and teenage commuting market with the Varsity. Introduced as a lightweight 10-speed sport bicycle, the Varsity was designed to compete with sleek European imports. However, the Varsity was anything but lightweight by European standards. It was built in the Chicago factory using Schwinn's signature electro-forged construction. The electro-forging process was an industrial marvel. Massive machines clamped the steel frame tubes together and sent thousands of amps of electricity through the joints. The steel melted and fused into a single, unbreakable piece. There were no messy welds. The joints were smooth and incredibly strong. This process made the Varsity heavy, often weighing over 40 pounds, but it made it virtually indestructible. College students bought the Varsity to commute across sprawling campuses. Adults bought them for weekend exercise. The Varsity could take a brutal beating. It could survive being dropped, crashed, and left out in the rain. It required almost zero maintenance. Like the Black Phantom and the Stingray before it, the Varsity became an instant American classic. It sold by the millions. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Schwinn reached the absolute peak of its power. The Chicago factory was a roaring engine of commerce. It covered blocks of city real estate. Thousands of workers marched through the gates every morning. The production numbers were staggering. At their height, Schwinn controlled nearly 25% of the entire American bicycle market. 1 out of every 4 bicycles sold in the United States carried the Schwinn head badge. They were untouchable. They had the best manufacturing facility in the country. They had the most loyal dealer network in the industry. They possessed a brand name that commanded total respect and absolute trust. A Schwinn bicycle was the vehicle that delivered the Sunday morning newspaper. It was the machine that carried a child to their first day of junior high school. It was the symbol of freedom that allowed teenagers to escape their neighborhoods and explore the world. The Chicago Empire had shaped the cultural landscape of America. They had dictated the terms of the market for nearly 8 decades, but total dominance is a dangerous narcotic. It blinds leaders to the shifting realities outside their factory walls. As the 1970s progressed, the world began to move faster. New trends were brewing in the dirt hills of California and the mountain trails of the Pacific Northwest. Schwinn executives sat comfortably in their Chicago offices, entirely confident that they controlled the future. They had no idea that they were standing on the edge of a massive, irreversible collapse. Chapter 3: The Disease of Complacency. The 1970s arrived. The bicycle market exploded again. This time, adults wanted 10-speed bikes for fitness and commuting. The bike boom of the early 70s pushed Schwinn to its absolute limits. The Chicago factory ran day and night. They sold over 1 million bicycles in a single year. The numbers looked incredible. The profits piled up, but success masked a growing rot inside the corporate structure. Frank W. Schwinn passed away. The leadership transitioned to the third generation. Frank V. Schwinn, known as Frankie V., took the helm. He inherited a massive, wealthy, and powerful empire. He also inherited a deeply conservative management culture. The executives in Chicago believed they knew better than the consumer. They looked at the sales charts and concluded their methods were flawless. They stopped listening to the streets. They stopped visiting independent bike shops to ask what kids actually wanted to ride. This arrogance infected the engineering department. The legendary electro-forged frames, once the backbone of their success, became a massive liability. The process required heavy, high-carbon steel. It produced incredibly strong bicycles, but it also made them incredibly heavy. A standard Schwinn 10-speed weighed nearly 40 pounds. Meanwhile, European and Japanese manufacturers were building lightweight lugged steel frames. Their bikes weighed 10 to 15 pounds less. They felt fast. They felt responsive. Consumers noticed the difference immediately. They walked into bike shops and lifted a Schwinn. Then they lifted a Japanese import like a Panasonic or a Fuji. The choice became obvious. But the executives in Chicago refused to adapt. Changing the manufacturing process meant abandoning their multi-million-dollar electro-forging machines. It meant retraining thousands of workers. It meant admitting their legendary engineering was no longer the global standard. Instead of changing, they doubled down. They aggressively marketed their heavy bikes as safer and more durable. They assumed the American public would remain blindly loyal to the brand name. The bureaucracy inside the corporate headquarters grew thick. Decisions that once took days now took months. Committees formed to study market trends, but they rarely acted on the data. The company became bloated. Middle management multiplied. The agility that Ignaz Schwinn used to survive the Great Depression vanished completely. They operated like a monopoly, expecting customers to wait patiently for whatever product they decided to release. Independent dealers started to complain. The people selling the bikes on the front lines saw the shift in consumer taste. They called Chicago. They begged for lighter frames. They asked for better components. The executives dismissed them. Management believed the dealers were just complaining to complain. Schwinn dictated the terms. If a dealer did not like it, Schwinn threatened to pull their franchise and give it to the shop down the street. The relationship between the manufacturer and the dealer soured. Resentment built up. Then, a massive shock hit the global economy. The 1973 oil crisis sent gas prices soaring. People panicked. They left their cars in the driveway and rushed to buy bicycles. The demand was unprecedented. Schwinn could not keep up. The Chicago factory hit maximum capacity. Dealerships ran out of inventory. Customers lined up outside stores waiting for delivery trucks. To meet the frantic demand, Schwinn made a fateful decision. They started importing bicycles from Japan. They partnered with Japanese manufacturers to build lightweight bikes, slapped the Schwinn name on them, and sold them in America. They called them the Schwinn approved line. This move temporarily solved their inventory problem, but it created a massive strategic disaster. By importing high-quality, lightweight Japanese bicycles, Schwinn inadvertently taught the American public that imported bikes were just as good, if not better, than bikes built in Chicago. They trained their own customers to appreciate foreign engineering. They validated their direct competitors. When the oil crisis ended and the bike boom subsided, the Japanese companies did not go away. They set up their own distribution networks in America. They bypassed Schwinn entirely. The Chicago executives watched the market share slip, but refused to panic. They sat in their wood-paneled offices and reviewed historical data. They told themselves the foreign invasion was a temporary phase. They believed American consumers would inevitably return to the heavy, familiar steel of a true Chicago Schwinn. They relied on nostalgia instead of innovation. They hosted grand dealer conventions to project strength, hiding the panic that should have been taking hold in the boardroom. This blind spot grew larger as the decade progressed. The youth market, the very demographic that saved the company in the 1930s and fueled the boom of the 1960s, was changing rapidly. Kids were no longer satisfied riding Stingrays around the paved neighborhood streets. They wanted to take their bikes off the pavement. They wanted to jump over dirt mounds. They wanted to race them on rough tracks. They were stripping down frames, adding knobby tires, and reinforcing handlebars. A brand new sport was taking shape on the dusty hills of Southern California. The engineers at Schwinn saw the trend. Some of them built prototypes for this new style of riding. They presented the designs to upper management. They pleaded for resources to mass produce a dedicated dirt bike. The executives looked at the prototypes and scoffed. They called it a passing fad. They refused to invest capital into what they considered a reckless, dangerous sport. They ordered the engineers back to their desks to focus on the traditional 10-speed market. They genuinely believed that if Schwinn did not build it, the kids would eventually stop wanting it. That decision would haunt them forever. By ignoring the streets, they alienated a massive, passionate demographic. They handed the future of the bicycle industry to young, hungry competitors who were willing to take risks. The disease of complacency had fully taken root in Chicago. The mighty factory continued to hum, but the soul of the company was dying. They were no longer the innovators. They had become the establishment. And in the fast-moving world of consumer products, becoming the establishment is the first step toward total ruin. Chapter 4: The Irony of the New Trend. The 1970s brought a strange revolution to the dirt hills of Southern California. Kids were taking their Schwinn Stingrays off the pavement. They stripped the heavy fenders. They bolted on knobby tires. They raced down dusty tracks and launched themselves over makeshift jumps. They wanted to imitate the professional motocross riders they saw on television. They called it bicycle motocross. The world would soon know it simply as BMX. The original Schwinn Stingray was never designed for this kind of abuse. The electro-forged steel frames were tough, but they were incredibly heavy. When teenagers jumped them high into the air, the heavy frames landed hard. The heavy steel components bent or broke under the extreme stress of competitive dirt racing. The kids needed something lighter. They needed something stronger. They needed frames built from lightweight chromoly steel. Small, unknown companies noticed this desperate need. Brands like Mongoose and Redline sprang up almost overnight in California garages. They welded lightweight, high-performance BMX frames specifically designed for racing and jumping. They sponsored local kids. They built a massive underground culture. The independent Schwinn dealers across the country saw this explosion firsthand. Kids walked into their shops holding broken Stingray parts. They asked for specialized BMX racing components. The dealers called the executives in Chicago. They reported the massive surge in dirt racing. They pleaded with the company to design a true lightweight BMX racing bicycle. The management board in Chicago looked at the reports and shook their heads. They operated in a city of concrete and steel. They simply did not understand the dirt tracks of California. They viewed BMX as a noisy, dangerous, and temporary fad. They refused to invest serious capital into redesigning their manufacturing process for a specialized racing market. They believed the kids would eventually grow up, calm down, and buy a traditional 10-speed varsity. When the pressure from dealers finally forced Schwinn to respond, their answer was tragically inadequate. In 1975, they released the Schwinn Scrambler. It looked like a BMX bike, but it was an illusion. Underneath the paint, it was still built using the outdated electroforging process. It was made of standard carbon steel. It was entirely too heavy to compete against the lightweight chromoly bikes built by the agile California startups. Serious BMX racers laughed at the Scrambler. For the first time in nearly a century, the Schwinn name did not command respect on the street. It represented the past. The small California brands captured the massive BMX market right under Schwinn's nose. But an even bigger missed opportunity was quietly brewing further north. In Marin County, near San Francisco, a group of thrill-seeking adults started racing bicycles down the steep, rocky trails of Mount Tamalpais. They called their sport repack racing because the friction of the long downhill runs burned the grease out of their coaster brakes, forcing them to repack the bearings after every single run. These riders needed bicycles that could survive the brutal, bone-shattering descent of a mountain. Flimsy European road bikes snapped in half. So, the pioneers of this new sport went searching through junkyards and old barns. They dug up ancient bicycles, built before World War II. The frame they prized above all others was the 1930s Schwinn Excelsior. Ignaz Schwinn and his son Frank had over-engineered the Excelsior 40 years earlier. They had used motorcycle welding techniques. The geometry of that old heavy frame was absolutely perfect for downhill stability. The Marin County riders stripped these vintage Schwinn frames down, added heavy-duty brakes, and bolted on modern gears. They created the very first mountain bikes. The irony was staggering. The fundamental DNA of the new mountain bike movement belonged entirely to Schwinn. Their decades-old engineering was the exact foundation of the fastest-growing cycling trend in modern history. But the executives sitting in the Chicago headquarters had no idea what was happening on Mount Tamalpais. Pioneers like Gary Fisher, Joe Breeze, and Tom Ritchie realized they could not rely on scavenging ancient Schwinn frames forever. They began welding their own specialized mountain bike frames. They built lightweight, incredibly strong machines. They started their own companies. They took the mountain bike from a weird Californian hobby and turned it into a global industry. Once again, the independent dealers recognized the shift before the corporate executives. By the early 1980s, mountain biking was exploding across the country. Customers walked into Schwinn dealerships asking for these rugged, multi-geared off-road machines. The dealers frantically called Chicago. They explained that adults did not want fragile 10-speed road bikes anymore. They wanted mountain bikes. T. The response from Chicago was deafeningly silent. The management team remained trapped in their own rigid paradigm. They had spent decades optimizing the factory to produce heavy road bikes and children's cruisers. Changing directions required admitting they were wrong. It required dismantling the very systems that had made them rich. They stalled. They studied the market endlessly without taking action. When Schwinn finally introduced a mountain bike, the market had already moved on. Companies like Specialized and Trek had firmly established themselves as the leaders of the new era. They had captured the imagination of the American public. They offered high-quality, lightweight mountain bikes built by factories overseas. They understood the culture because they had grown out of it. Schwinn, on the other hand, looked like an old dinosaur trying to learn a new trick. The failure to capture the BMX and mountain bike markets fundamentally broke the aura of invincibility surrounding the Chicago Empire. Schwinn had always been the absolute leader. They had always dictated what the American public would ride. Now, they were a massive, slow-moving follower. The agile competitors they had dismissed as temporary nuisances were suddenly stealing their most valuable customers. The financial consequences hit the company hard. Sales figures began to stagnate. The massive overhead costs of running the aging Chicago factory became a heavy burden. The profits that once flowed freely began to slow down to a trickle. The executives finally realized they had a serious problem. They had lost their connection to the rider. They had lost their edge. And the massive brick factory that had birthed the American bicycle industry was quietly turning into a financial prison. Chapter 5. The Dark Cloud Over the Historic Factory. The Schwinn factory on Kildare Avenue in Chicago stood as a monument to American industrial might. Ignaz Schwinn built the first sections of this complex back in the 19th century. Over the decades, the company added new wings, new floors, and new buildings as demand grew. By the late 1970s, the facility covered over 1 million square feet. It was a massive fortress of red brick and steel, but inside the walls, the fortress was slowly falling apart. The layout of the factory belonged to a completely forgotten era. Modern manufacturing relies on ruthless efficiency. Competitors built sprawling, single-story facilities where raw steel entered one door and finished bicycles rolled out the other in a straight, unbroken line. The Chicago factory was a chaotic, frustrating maze. It possessed multiple floors. Workers moved heavy steel frames up and down cramped, unreliable freight elevators. Parts traveled across different buildings through enclosed wooden bridges. The wooden floors sagged under the weight of heavy inventory. The windows were caked with decades of black industrial grime. The roof leaked during severe Midwest thunderstorms. This outdated vertical layout wasted enormous amounts of time, energy, and physical labor. Every extra movement cost the company precious money. The equipment inside the factory matched the decaying walls. The famous electro-forging machines that built the invincible varsity frames were absolute engineering marvels in the 1950s. 30 years later, they were expensive, outdated liabilities. These massive machines consumed terrifying amounts of electricity. During the energy crisis of the 1970s, the power bills alone threatened to bankrupt the facility. Furthermore, the machines broke down frequently. Repairing them required specialized mechanics and custom-made parts that no one else in the world manufactured anymore. While Japanese and Taiwanese factories invested heavily in lightweight TIG welding technologies, Schwinn kept feeding their old monsters. They refused to abandon the heavy carbon steel process. Upgrading the factory meant spending tens of millions of dollars. The executives looked at the massive price tag and immediately balked. They chose to patch the old machines instead of buying new ones. They slapped temporary fixes on fundamental structural problems. They ignored the core issue of manufacturing inefficiency. The human cost of running the Kildare facility was just as heavy as the machinery. The factory employed over 2,000 workers. These men and women belonged to the United Auto Workers Union, Local 2122. They fought hard over the decades for their wages, health benefits, and safe working conditions. For a long time, the relationship between the Schwinn family and the union remained relatively stable. The company made massive profits, and the workers earned a solid, respectable middle-class living. But the harsh financial reality of the late 1970s shattered that fragile peace. Inflation ravaged the American economy. The cost of raw steel skyrocketed. Energy prices doubled. The profit margins on every single bicycle rolling off the Chicago assembly line began to shrink rapidly. The executives panicked. They desperately needed to cut costs. But they could not easily change the vertical layout of the old brick building. They could not easily replace the massive electro-forging machines. The only flexible variable they saw on their balance sheets was the human workforce. Management started pushing the factory workers much harder. They aggressively increased production quotas. They demanded significantly faster assembly times. The noise on the factory floor grew louder. The heat from the aging welding stations became unbearable during the brutal Chicago summers. The air hung thick with oil and metal dust. Workers felt the intense, unforgiving pressure. Morale plummeted rapidly. The men and women who had spent their entire adult lives building bicycles felt the company turning its back on them. The historic pride of American craftsmanship gave way to the pure, brutal metrics of mass production speed. The executives, sitting in the quiet, air-conditioned corporate offices, did not understand the growing anger on the factory floor. They only looked at financial spreadsheets. The spreadsheets told a terrifying story. Schwinn was bleeding money in Chicago. To stay competitive against the massive flood of cheap foreign imports, they needed to fundamentally change how they built bicycles. They faced a critical, defining choice. They could take their accumulated corporate wealth and invest it heavily back into American manufacturing. They could buy cheap land outside Chicago, build a modern, high-tech, single-story facility, and train their loyal workforce to use new, lightweight welding techniques. This path required massive upfront investment, extreme patience, and a deep, unshakable commitment to their hometown workers. Instead, the leadership chose the easy way out. They chose the absolute shortest path to profitability. They looked across the Pacific Ocean. They saw modern factories in Japan and Taiwan building excellent bicycles for a fraction of the cost. The overseas labor was incredibly cheap. The foreign facilities were brand new. The foreign governments offered massive tax incentives to attract American business. Schwinn management began to quietly shift their entire business strategy. They did not announce a grand plan to close the Chicago factory. Instead, they slowly and secretly started outsourcing vital components. First, they imported cheap gears and brakes. Then, they imported wheels and handlebars. Finally, they began importing entirely finished bicycles, packed in cardboard boxes, simply applying the familiar Schwinn decals once the products reached American soil. This secret pivot sent a clear, chilling message to the workers in Chicago. The company was actively hedging its bets. Management no longer believed the historic factory was the absolute center of the Schwinn universe. They viewed the Kildare Avenue complex as a massive financial burden rather than a strategic asset. Tension inside the brick walls reached a dangerous boiling point. The union leaders saw the foreign imported bikes arriving in shipping containers. They saw their own overtime hours aggressively slashed. They watched the factory maintenance budget completely dry up. They realized the executives were slowly starving the Chicago plant to death to fund their new international partnerships. The mutual trust between the workers and the Schwinn family evaporated completely. The factory floor transformed from a place of shared purpose into a hostile battleground. Management blindly demanded more output for less money. The workers rightfully demanded job security and fair compensation for the brutal, declining conditions. The two sides locked themselves in a bitter, silent war. The dark cloud over the historic factory finally blocked out the sun. The corporate executives thought they could manage the decline quietly. They thought they could slowly transition the mighty empire overseas without causing an explosion at home. They fundamentally underestimated the fierce anger and deep pride of the American industrial worker. By choosing the cheap shortcut over genuine innovation, they set the stage for a catastrophic confrontation. The breaking point arrived in the winter of 1980. The mighty gears of the Chicago factory were about to grind to a violent, definitive halt. Chapter 6. The Shocking Strike of 1980. The year 1980 brought a bitter winter to Chicago. The tension inside the Schwinn factory on Kildare Avenue finally reached its absolute breaking point. For months, the workers felt the crushing weight of ruthless management decisions. The company demanded faster production rates on the assembly line. They refused to increase wages to match soaring national inflation. They cut back on vital factory maintenance, leaving the work environment dirty and unsafe. And worst of all, the workers watched foreign imported bicycles arrive in shipping containers, carrying the iconic Schwinn name. The betrayal was incredibly obvious. The executives were slowly starving the American factory to feed their cheaper overseas operations. In October 1980, the United Auto Workers Local 2122, which represented the men and women of the Chicago plant, sat down with Schwinn executives to negotiate a new contract. The workers wanted basic survival guarantees. They wanted job security. They wanted strict limits on how much production the company could move to Asia. They wanted fair compensation for the brutal hours they spent working the aging, dangerous machinery. The executives flatly refused. Management claimed the company was losing money and losing market share. They demanded financial concessions from the workforce. They demanded total flexibility to outsource parts and finished bicycles to foreign factories. The negotiations collapsed completely. On a cold autumn morning, the workers made their final decision. They dropped their tools. They shut down the massive electro-forging machines. They turned off the welding torches. Thousands of men and women walked out of the massive brick factory and formed loud, angry picket lines on the Chicago sidewalks. For the first time in over 8 decades, the mighty Schwinn factory fell completely silent. The silence was terrifying. The roaring heartbeat of the American bicycle industry simply stopped. The heavy stamping presses sat frozen. The paint booths dried up. The conveyor belts stopped moving. Bicycles sat half-finished on the racks, collecting dust. The sudden shutdown sent a massive shockwave through the entire corporate structure. The timing of the strike could not have been worse for the independent dealers. Retailers across the country desperately prepared for the crucial holiday shopping season. They needed fresh inventory. They called Chicago, demanding their scheduled shipments of Stingrays and Varsities. But nothing came out of the Kildare Avenue plant. The supply chain shattered. Shop owners watched their showrooms empty out. Customers walked in asking for Schwinn bicycles and left empty-handed. Frustrated dealers turned to other brands just to keep their store doors open. Inside the corporate headquarters, panic set in. The executives did not expect a total, unified walkout. They assumed the union would cave under the immediate threat of lost wages. They fundamentally underestimated the deep anger and historic pride of their own workforce. But instead of returning to the negotiating table with a fair compromise, management doubled down on their disastrous corporate strategy. They looked to their new overseas partners to save them. A massive Taiwanese bicycle manufacturer named Giant had recently started building the lightweight, Schwinn-approved models. The Chicago executives contacted Giant immediately. They begged the Taiwanese factory to radically increase production. They asked them to flood the American market with imported bicycles to bypass the striking American workers entirely. Giant happily agreed. They rapidly ramped up their modern assembly lines. They packed thousands of bicycles into massive shipping containers and sent them across the Pacific Ocean. Back in Chicago, the striking workers watched those exact containers arrive. The message from management was crystal clear. The executives did not need the Chicago workers anymore. They proved they were entirely willing to abandon the hometown factory and rely strictly on cheap foreign labor. The strike transformed from a basic labor dispute over wages into a desperate fight for survival. The men and women on the picket lines stood their ground through the bitter Chicago winter. They burned trash in metal barrels to stay warm. They held their protest signs high. These were people whose fathers and grandfathers had poured their sweat into building the Schwinn empire. They felt a deep personal ownership of the brand. They built the iconic machines that defined millions of American childhoods. Now, they watched their legacy get boxed up and shipped overseas by a management team completely disconnected from the factory floor. The strike dragged on for 13 grueling weeks. It bled both sides completely dry. The workers lost months of vital income. They struggled to feed their families during a harsh economic recession. The company lost massive amounts of market share. They permanently alienated hundreds of independent dealers who felt totally abandoned during the holiday rush. The financial losses ran into the tens of millions of dollars. Finally, in early 1981, pure exhaustion forced a resolution. The union and the executives signed a new contract. The workers slowly returned to the Kildare Avenue plant. The heavy machines roared back to life. The sparks flew again. Bicycles started rolling off the assembly line. But everything had fundamentally changed. The factory was no longer a place of pride. It felt like a tomb. The strike completely destroyed the relationship between the Schwinn family and their workforce. The generational loyalty evaporated into thin air. Workers did their jobs, but the passion was entirely gone. They knew management viewed them strictly as an expensive liability. Management knew the workers no longer trusted a single word coming from the corporate office. The invisible contract of American manufacturing was officially dead. When the line workers picked up their tools again, they noticed immediate, terrifying changes. The overall volume of work in the factory was visibly shrinking. Certain parts of the massive complex remained dark and quiet. Entire assembly lines were permanently shut down and covered in plastic tarps. The company claimed it was a temporary measure to recover from the financial hit of the strike. The workers knew better. They saw the shipping manifests. They knew exactly how many fully assembled bicycles were arriving from Taiwan every single week. The Taiwanese imports were no longer just a small supplement to the main Chicago production. They were rapidly becoming the core of the entire business. The giant factory in Taiwan was a marvel of modern efficiency. It was a stark contrast to the crumbling brick maze on Kildare Avenue. Giant used advanced TIG welding. They built strong, incredibly lightweight chromoly frames. They adapted quickly to new market trends. While the Chicago workers were forced to continue building the heavy, outdated electro-forged cruisers, the Taiwanese workers were building the agile, modern bikes that consumers actually wanted to buy. This dynamic created a toxic atmosphere of profound humiliation inside the American plant. The master craftsmen of Chicago were forced to assemble outdated products, while their own executives praised the superior quality of the foreign imports. The pride of American manufacturing was being systematically dismantled from the inside out. The executives isolated themselves from this harsh reality. They did not walk the factory floor. They did not look the veteran workers in the eye. They only looked at the profit margins of the Taiwanese imports, which were undeniably higher. The executives also learned a dangerous lesson from the 13-week shutdown. They realized that Giant could successfully build massive quantities of bicycles without the headaches of an aging American factory. The imported bikes arrived on time. They were built with better techniques. They cost significantly less to produce. The historic strike of 1980 did not save the Chicago plant. It merely signed its death warrant. The corporate leadership stopped viewing the Kildare Avenue facility as the beating heart of their empire. They now viewed it as a massive, outdated obstacle, blocking their path to maximum profitability. The historic brick walls that protected the company through the Great Depression and World War II were now closing in on them. The workers clocked in and clocked out, completely unaware that their fate was already sealed. They continued to build heavy steel frames, while the executives in the front office drafted secret plans to tear the entire empire down. The strike proved that Schwinn could easily survive without Chicago. The only question remaining was how quickly they could pack up and leave. The final countdown to total abandonment had officially begun. Chapter 7. The Fatal Decision. The devastating strike of 1980 ended, but the trust between the workers and the company never returned. Edward R. Schwinn Jr. had taken control of the empire. He looked at the massive, aging Chicago plant and saw only a severe financial liability. The vertical layout of the factory, the heavy, outdated machinery, and the unionized workforce all dragged down the bottom line. The company was losing money. The market share was slipping away to foreign imports and new agile competitors. Edward wanted a clean break. He wanted cheap, efficient production. He found his definitive answer in Taichung, Taiwan. Giant Manufacturing was a relatively young company. They had massive ambition and a large pool of cheap labor, but they lacked the technical mastery required to build premium bicycles for the demanding global market. Schwinn possessed exactly what Giant desperately needed. Schwinn had nearly a century of proprietary engineering knowledge. They had strict, refined quality control standards. They had the most powerful brand name in the bicycle world. The Chicago executives flew across the Pacific Ocean. They sat down with Giant leadership and signed a fatal agreement. Schwinn agreed to outsource a massive portion of their production to Taiwan. But they went much further than a simple purchase order to ensure the imported bicycles met strict American expectations, Schwinn sent their own master engineers directly to the giant factory. This transfer of knowledge was unprecedented. The American engineers taught the Taiwanese workers everything. They handed over detailed technical blueprints. They established rigorous quality control protocols on the assembly line. They taught them advanced chromoly welding techniques. They introduced Giant to global supply chain networks for premium gears and brakes. Schwinn essentially took their own money and their own historic expertise and used it to build a state-of-the-art competitor. Back in Chicago, the writing was clearly on the wall. The volume of work at the Kildare Avenue plant dropped drastically. Workers swept empty floors. They stared at idle machinery. The imported Taiwanese bicycles arrived in massive numbers and sold exceptionally well on the showroom floors. The executives looked at the climbing profit margins and made their final, ruthless calculation. They simply did not need the Chicago workers anymore. In 1982, management dropped the axe. They officially announced the permanent closure of the historic Chicago factory. The news hit the city like a physical blow. This was not just a standard business decision. It was the sudden death of a legendary American institution. Entire families had worked inside those red brick walls for 3 generations. They had poured molten steel. They had laced wheels. They had built the iconic bicycles that defined millions of American childhoods. They had survived the Great Depression and World War II. Now, they were tossed aside for cheaper overseas labor. The final days of the Kildare Avenue plant were deeply tragic. The men and women who built the legendary Black Phantom, the Varsity, and the Stingray packed up their personal toolboxes. They walked out of the massive iron gates for the very last time. The giant electro-forging machines, the mechanical heart of the Schwinn empire, went completely cold. The sprawling, million-square-foot fortress that once produced over 1 million bicycles a year fell into a heavy, permanent silence. The corporate executives felt incredibly smart. They believed they had successfully navigated a difficult transition. They eliminated their biggest financial burden. They busted the power of the local union. They secured a massive, steady supply of high-quality, low-cost bicycles. They sat in their quiet offices and watched the profits temporarily stabilize. They firmly believed they had saved the company from certain ruin. They were entirely wrong. They had just committed corporate suicide. By moving production to Taiwan and transferring their closely guarded engineering secrets, Schwinn severed their vital connection to the actual manufacturing process. A company that does not physically build its own products eventually forgets how to innovate. Schwinn rapidly degraded into a simple marketing shell. They became a company that merely imported and distributed bicycles built by someone else. They lost the gritty, hands-on mechanical intuition that Ignaz Schwinn used to build the company back in 1895. Meanwhile, Giant absorbed every single lesson. They utilized Schwinn's massive production volume to achieve incredible economies of scale. They used Schwinn's engineering standards to perfect their own manufacturing processes. They grew rapidly in size and skill. They became stronger, faster, and much more efficient than the old Chicago empire ever was. The fatal flaw in Schwinn's master plan was blind arrogance. The executives believed the Schwinn brand name was the only thing that actually mattered to consumers. They assumed Giant would remain a quiet, obedient supplier forever. They never considered that the ambitious Taiwanese manufacturer might want a piece of the lucrative global market for themselves. As the 1980s progressed, Giant realized they no longer needed Schwinn to survive. They knew exactly how to build world-class bicycles. They owned the massive factories. They had the cheap, highly skilled labor. All they needed was their own brand name. They started selling bicycles under the Giant label directly to the European and American markets. They offered the exact same premium quality as a Schwinn, but they sold them at a significantly lower price. Schwinn management watched in absolute horror as their own dedicated supplier turned into their most dangerous competitor. The Chicago executives tried to fight back, but they had no weapons left in their arsenal. They had closed their own historic factory. They had fired their own master craftsmen. They had willingly given away their proprietary knowledge. They were completely defenseless against the machine they had built. The decision to partner with Giant and abandon Chicago was the ultimate turning point in the history of the brand. Schwinn traded a century of proud manufacturing independence for a short-term boost in corporate profit. They fed a hungry foreign manufacturer until it grew into an unstoppable monster. And now, that monster was turning its eyes toward the very empire that had created it. The end of the legendary Schwinn dynasty was no longer just a possibility. It was an absolute certainty. Chapter 8: The Shattered Legacy. The late 1980s proved completely disastrous for the Schwinn Bicycle Company. Edward Schwinn Jr. had bet the entire future of the business on outsourcing to Taiwan. He closed the historic Chicago factory to save money. He fired the highly skilled American workforce to cut overhead costs. On paper, the financial math looked perfectly logical to the executives. In reality, he destroyed the very soul of the brand. By giving Giant Manufacturing the exact blueprints to build world-class bicycles, Schwinn permanently lost its ultimate competitive advantage. Giant no longer needed the Chicago executives to succeed. The ambitious Taiwanese company established its own global distribution network. They launched their own branded bicycles directly into the American and European markets. They offered the exact same premium engineering quality as a Schwinn, but they sold their products at a significantly lower price point. Schwinn dealerships across America noticed the fatal shift immediately. Customers walked into the shops and compared the two products side by side. They saw the Giant label and recognized the superior build quality. They saw the Schwinn label and felt a deep sense of disconnect. The iconic American brand no longer meant anything special. It was just another outsourced, imported bicycle. The financial bleeding inside the Schwinn corporate headquarters accelerated rapidly. The company desperately tried to pivot again to stop the losses. They moved production from Taiwan to an even cheaper factory in China. This decision proved catastrophically foolish. The new Chinese facility completely failed to meet strict manufacturing and quality control standards. They shipped thousands of highly defective bicycles directly to the United States. Frames cracked under pressure. Brakes failed to stop the wheels. Gears refused to shift properly. Furious independent dealers spent all their valuable time repairing broken brand new bicycles instead of selling them. They flooded the corporate office with angry phone calls. They demanded immediate refunds. Many longtime loyal dealers finally gave up on the brand entirely. They pulled down the legendary Schwinn signs from their storefronts and replaced them with specialized Trek or Giant logos. By 1992, the Schwinn family empire completely collapsed under the crushing weight of massive corporate debt. The company owed millions of dollars to furious creditors. They had absolutely no cash left to run daily operations. They had no modern factories left to leverage. They had no unique engineering patents left to protect their market position. The Great American Bicycle Dynasty officially filed for bankruptcy. The news shocked the global business world. Schwinn was an untouchable titan for nearly a century. They survived the brutal economic crash of the 1890s. They survived the Great Depression. They survived 2 world wars, but they could not survive their own arrogant management decisions. The bankruptcy court systematically tore the historic company apart. Outside investors bought the shattered remains of the business for pennies on the dollar. The Schwinn family lost total control of the mighty brand that Ignaz Schwinn built from nothing in 1895. The name passed from one corporate holding company to another over the next decade. Each new corporate owner tried to squeeze a little more profit out of the rapidly decaying legacy. Meanwhile, Giant Manufacturing absolutely dominated the global bicycle industry. They used the precise engineering knowledge they learned from the Chicago Masters to build a massive international empire. Today, Giant builds millions of bicycles every single year. They design the most advanced, lightweight carbon fiber racing frames in the world. They sponsor professional cycling teams that win the biggest global races. They operate massive, hyper-efficient factories that set the ultimate standard for modern manufacturing. Giant achieved the exact explosive success that Schwinn executives thought they were buying back in the early 1980s. The Taiwanese company respected the physical manufacturing process. They kept their best engineers close to the active assembly line. They never stopped pushing to innovate. They never stopped listening to the riders on the street. They picked up the heavy crown that Chicago willingly threw away. The contrast between the two companies today is deeply tragic. If you walk into an independent, professional bicycle shop today, you will not find a new Schwinn. The brand lost its prestigious placement years ago. Instead, you have to drive to a massive discount department store. You have to walk down the crowded, fluorescent-lit toy aisle. There, sitting right next to cheap plastic swimming pools and imported basketballs, you will find the modern Schwinn. It is a heavy, poorly assembled bicycle built with the absolute cheapest possible components. The iconic 4-pointed star logo is still glued to the front of the steel frame. But the logo is completely hollow. It means absolutely nothing. The legendary machine that once defined American resilience is now treated as a disposable children's toy. The bicycles that Frank Schwinn built to last a lifetime are gone. The modern versions are designed to be ridden a few times and then thrown into a landfill when the cheap plastic gears snap in half. The heartbreaking tragedy of the Chicago factory serves as a brutal lesson for modern business leaders. A powerful brand name is not a magic shield against bad decisions. You cannot sell your manufacturing soul to the lowest foreign bidder and expect your core legacy to survive. Ignaz Schwinn built an unmatched empire by mastering raw steel and refusing to ever compromise on premium quality. His grandson dismantled that exact same empire by looking for a cheap financial shortcut. The massive red brick factory on Kildare Avenue no longer exists. Real estate developers tore the historic buildings down long ago. The sacred ground where thousands of American workers once built the Stingray and the Black Phantom is gone. All that remains of the true empire are the vintage bicycles themselves. If you visit a classic car show or a vintage bicycle rally today, you will still see them. You will see perfectly restored 50-year-old Chicago Schwinns gleaming brightly in the summer sunlight. You will see the flawless electro-forged steel joints. You will see the heavy, polished chrome fenders. True collectors treat these old machines with absolute reverence. They know these heavy bicycles represent the true, original spirit of the brand. These vintage bikes still roll perfectly smooth. They still survive the harsh test of time. They silently prove that the American workers inside that Chicago factory knew exactly what they were doing. The workers built a timeless legacy out of solid steel. The executives completely shattered it out of pure greed. The physical company died, but the original machines fiercely refused to fade away.